born despite consistent warnings from the founders and the old revolutionaries about the dangers to liberty that comes from a faction-first or party-first mentality and approach on almost everything. The way I see it, other than, of course, us here today, almost everyone ignores this warning and goes that route anyway. And it absolutely has to stop if we ever want to get from where we are today, the largest government in history, to a real land of the free. And I want to kick this off with some quotes from Noah Webster in his great paper, The Revolution in France in 1794, which he sent to George Washington. I've got the letter that he sent along with that in just a few minutes. But here's how Webster put it. Nothing is more dangerous to the cause of truth and liberty than a party spirit. To Noah Webster, if your first thought was how to be loyal to the team and how to defend the team, that is the most dangerous thing to the cause of truth and liberty. And he explained why. Because you get this kind of attachment to the wrong thing, to the wrong principle. He said, when men are once united, in whatever form or upon whatever occasion, the union creates a partiality or friendship for each member of the party or society. A coalition for any purpose creates an attachment and inspires a confidence in the individuals of the party, which does not die with the cause which united them, but continues and extends to every other object of social intercourse. And I could come up with an almost endless list of similar warnings along these lines. But thanks to government-run education, most people are totally ignorant of this, and they would reject this view just almost immediately after hearing it. And I guess Thomas Jefferson was absolutely correct when he said, if a nation expects to be ignorant and free in a state of civilization, it expects what never was and never will be. Now, this ignorance, I think, on this count should be totally obvious to all of us here today, especially when we consider the fact that so many people who claim to be opposed to endless wars absolutely love the so-called peace president who kept going with a bunch of wars and even started some new ones. Or on the other end of the spectrum, the political spectrum, that is, so many people who claim to support the natural right of self-defense, the right to keep and bear arms, they put all their support behind the so-called Second Amendment president, the same dude who actually enforced more federal gun control than anyone in history and bragged about it. Absolutely terrible on both ends of the spectrum on this stuff. But anyways, this is nothing new under the sun whatsoever. And I want to go back to Thomas Gordon, who I've cited on this show a number of times in his great Works of Sallust. Gordon was a great influence on the founders. I'll get to that in a moment. This is from 1744. And Gordon put it this way: it is with measures as with men. They are praised or condemned, not because they are right or wrong, beneficial or hurtful, but because they come from this party or the other. Sure sounds familiar, doesn't it? It explains why you can see, depending on which administration or which team is in power in Washington, D.C., you can see how the opposing team who previously supported the same kind of actions all of a sudden think it's the worst thing on earth, or vice versa. People flip-flop back and forth on the exact same type of federal power depending on who does it. And this is a great example of what we live under right now. Gordon continued, evil is turned into good and good into evil. Truth passes for falsehood. Falsehood is dressed up in the guise of truth. The best actions are decried as the worst if they arise from one quarter. The worst actions adored as the best if from the other. So people totally set aside any moral or constitutional principles because their number one goal is to support the party or the team. And again, this just isn't some random dude saying this. This is Thomas Gordon. Gordon was one of the most influential writers on the founders and old revolutionaries, primarily for his work with Trenchard in the early 18th century on a series of papers known as Cato's Letters. And here's how Joe Wolverton describes it. Cato's letters were so popular to the founding generation that they were quoted in every colonial newspaper from Boston to Savannah. Additionally, historian Gary Nash records that, quote, Trenchard and Gordon were the most important disseminators of ideas to Americans in pre-revolutionary generations. And then Forrest McDonald put it this way: Cato's Letters was the most quoted book in all the Americans' pre-revolutionary writing. So really important people here. Let's go back to Gordon with that foundation. And he put it this way: party principles are therefore substituted for moral principles. So when we're talking about a party first or faction first mentality, we're just saying that people have that as their number one goal, and they are willing to change their view on every other issue, constitutional or moral, whatever it may be, in order to support or oppose one party or another. Thomas Gordon again put it like this: party principles are therefore substituted for moral principles. The sure way to destroy all morality and to confound the characters of men and even those of good and evil. Gordon continued. He said, yet from this spirit, this baneful and pestilent spirit of party, the ablest and best men are often precluded from the service of their country, the weakest, the worst, and most contemptible employed in its service. Now, back when he was one of the good guys, this is even before they called him the Atlas of Independence, writing back in 1763, John Adams, actually, you could tell that he was influenced by this writing because he's like, the best and ablest of people have always been employed in support of one team or against another. He said, but I would quarrel with both parties and with every individual of each before I would subjugate my understanding or prostitute my tongue or pen to either. Now, unfortunately, today, most people are willing to prostitute their pen, tongue, or whatever to one team or another, and then they change their tune based on who does almost the exact same thing. But let's go back to Thomas Gordon a little bit, all the way back to his Cato's Letters. These, again, were early 18th century. Here's from letter number 51 in 1721. These will all be linked to in the show notes over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path2liberty. Alan Mosley will organize the blog post. I'll get it published a couple hours after the live stream is done here this morning. Again, 10thamendmentcenter.com/path2liberty. That way you can be like, Bolden, where the heck is that Cato letter number 51? Well, it's going to be linked to right there so you can read it in context and learn more on your own time. You'll also find all the different platforms we're on. Of course, we're on video and then audio only. We live stream on the mainstream platforms like YouTube and Facebook, LinkedIn, X, Twitch, and elsewhere. We're also at rumble.com, odyssey.com, and all the different audio platforms that we can get on. And if you want to recommend that we need to add more, I would like to do that. We're a little slow sometimes in expanding that, but feel free to email me, team@10thamendmentcenter.com, or leave us a comment on any one of the platforms you happen to listen to or watch on if we're missing from someplace important. Anyways, 10thamendmentcenter.com/path2liberty is where you're going to find the blog post for this episode and every one. So back to Thomas Gordon, Cato's letter number 51. Where parties prevail, a principal way to gain popularity is to act foolishly for one side and wickedly against the other. We often get people asking us to do this kind of thing. Why don't you spend more time talking about Joe? Why don't you spend more time talking about Barry or George or Donald? And we got to focus all of our energy on that rather than the overarching principle that we're focusing on, that the founding generation warned us about, and that is too much consolidation, too much centralization of power, no matter who has the power, because it's not a personnel problem that we're facing. We're facing an issue of power. And the faction first people want us always to focus on the personnel because it feeds into their goals, which is to elevate their team and attack the other. Anyways, Gordon continued, and therefore some public talkers have grown popular by calling those whom they disliked by bitter and ill-bred names, or by rioting and making a noise for some sounds which they had taken a liking to, or by insulting and abusing those who affronted them, by being more sober and sensible than the others. Anyways, this is basically political discourse of today. This dude is dumb. This dude is brilliant. I'm great. You're stupid. And this just leads to more and more of the same. People setting aside principles to support or oppose teams. Here's Gordon again, Cato's letter number 134 in 1723. He said, so that in raising parties and factions, inflaming goes 1,000 times farther than reasoning and teaching. And again, we have so many people that tell us over and over, why don't you have millions of followers like this political commentator? Well, it's because we don't spend our time inflaming and supporting a faction or opposing another. We focus on reasoning and teaching, and we'll take the kind of tortoise versus hare approach on all this. Going further, Thomas Gordon says, a foolish speech supported with vehemence and brandy will conquer the best sense and the best cause in the world without anger or liquor. I love that one. Anyways, back to Noah Webster. He said, the moment a man is attached to a club, his mind is not free. Now, George Washington, in his farewell address, takes a similar approach on permanent alliances with other countries. He said, don't do this because then you've created a scenario where you are, in essence, a nation that has a permanent alliance with another is in some, or antipathy, is in some way a slave to their passions. And that's very similar to what Noah Webster is saying here. He said, the moment a man is attached to a club, his mind is not free. He receives a bias from the opinions of the party. A question indifferent to him is no longer indifferent when it materially affects a brother of the society. Don't talk bad about Team Red. Don't talk bad about Team Blue. Most people are so concerned with whether or not you're a good team player, party member, rather than whether you're upholding your oath of office. And again, that gets down to some of the government right education and people not loving liberty and some other things. A little further here. He is not left to act for himself. He is bound in honor to take part with the society, his pride and his prejudices. If at war with his opinion, will commonly obtain the victory, and rather than incur the ridicule or censure of his associates, he will countenance their measures at all hazards. And thus an independent freeman is converted into a mere walking machine, a convenient engine of party leaders. I think the party leaders of today look at every one of you, all of us, as a convenient engine of party leaders. What can we do to inflame their passions in order to spend all of their time opposing the other guy, ignoring the bad stuff we do, or just supporting us, and that's it. That's really what it gets down to. We're not humans with individual liberty. That's not how they treat us. They treat us, they're all socialists, really. They treat us as, well, machines. Here's Noah Webster sending this paper from 1794 to George Washington, April 20th. He said, at the perfect critical juncture of our political affairs, it appears to be the duty of every good citizen to use his influence in restraining the violence of parties and moderating the passions of our injured fellow citizens. So he sent to Washington this revolution in France. And I don't know how influential Webster was on Washington's farewell address. It certainly was first drafted a couple of years earlier. Washington had it drafted because he wanted to step down in 1792. So Madison did a lot of writing on that. James Madison did under his direction. Jefferson actually helped convince him to stay on. And so then Washington worked with Hamilton to kind of update it for his actual farewell in 1796. But you can see this kind of long train of viewpoints going back to Trenchard and Gordon, to Cato's letters, to John Adams, to Noah Webster. Very consistent views going here. And Washington talked about faction and parties as well. He said the alternate domination of one faction over another, sharpened by the spirit of revenge, natural to party dissension, which in different ages and countries has perpetrated the most horrid of enormities, is itself a frightful despotism. But this leads at length to a more formal and permanent despotism. The disorders and miseries which result gradually incline the minds of men to seek security and repose in the absolute power of an individual. And sooner or later, the chief of some prevailing faction, more able or more fortunate than his competitors, turns this disposition to the purposes of his own elevation on the ruins of public liberty. Now, Washington pointed out right after this, this is a far-off thing. But we are far off from that time, and I would say George Washington absolutely called it. One more from Noah Webster. I think tying this all together kind of tells us why he said, faction is death to liberty. And one of my favorites along these lines, I got a couple of my favorite ones here to wrap it up. Here from Benjamin Franklin in Poor Richard Improved, 1753. He said, ignorance leads men into a party, and shame keeps them from getting out again. Benjamin Franklin always had a way with words. Now, if you're not familiar with Poor Richard Improve or Poor Richard's Almanac, it was a really popular thing that he published for like 25, 26 years, from like 1730 to whatever. My math is terrible. I went to government-run school. It was filled with all kinds of great pithy quotes, advice, etc. Now, this particular one was so popular because it was followed up also the next quote right after ignorance leads men into a party and shame keeps them from getting out again. The next quote was, haste makes waste. Anyways, that'll be linked to in the show notes so you can read the whole thing on your own time in context. And let's wrap it up with Thomas Jefferson in a letter to Francis Hopkinson pointing out that he was neither Federalist nor anti-Federalist. He said, if I could not go to heaven but with a party, I would not go there at all. Well, I hope you guys found this interesting. I hope it was educational. More important than anything, I hope you learned something. If you want to help us spread the word and get this kind of message out to more and more people, absolutely nothing helps us roll up our sleeves and do this work every single day more than the financial faith and support of our members. You got a couple of bucks of that dirty government fiat, please consider throwing it our way over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. It's $2 a month, or we have annual, 5-year, and lifetime options. So we try to be a little flexible with that. No pressure, but please take a look over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. Again, I really appreciate you spending some of your time with me today. I hope you enjoyed the episode. I hope you have an awesome weekend, and I hope to see you next week here on the Path to Liberty.